Hello and welcome to today's reading of a chapter from Soundtrack to the End of the World, available now in both paperback and hardcover limited signed editions. I was looking through the novel, looking for a good place to read from, and I decided to start on chapter 6. So I'm going to read chapter 6 of the novel, chapter 6. Corey and I lived in Tourist Central for the New York and New Jersey area. Tourist Central though it was, the closest thing to a city we had was Main Street, a matter of a dozen blocks of bars and stores. And these were no city blocks vanishing into the horizon. Our sidewalks ended before you realized they even started. But then, part of the reason anyone lived in a locale like Ladenburg, and why so many New Yorkers and Jerseyites visited, was due to it being a fairly isolated territory. Behind the buildings and past the concrete sidewalks there were trees. Not just a single tree protruding from a square of dirt surrounded by cement, but whole forests of trees, right behind the stores. Look up and you'd see mountains. Walk for more than half an hour and you'd find a river. That was the attraction. Instead of living where the reality was pavement scattered with reminders of nature, mounds of grass and clusters of trees like mirages in the smog, these tourists could visit the mirror image. It was the cityscape here that was a mirage, the reality of forests and mountains surrounding it, looking like a looming deity. Corey and I stopped in front of the music store, Jasper's, and looked through the display window. "Did you go check out the aura reader yet?" "Yeah," I said. "I have another appointment later in the week." Corey looked at me from the corners of his eyes. "You're going back? Didn't Skinny give you only one free pass? Which, by the way, I still think is screwed up. Giving you a gift for your parents." Cutting him off, I said, "Don't worry." Skinny thought it would help me deal with it. I scratched my beard. "He knew you'd get pissed." "Damn right." Corey looked away and rubbed his head. "It's not the sort of thing you give presents for." "Yeah. Well, I was hoping to talk to Dr. Pepper about it, but he wasn't at the reunion." Corey smiled too wide and said, "So, anyway, why are you going back to Naomi's if she's just giving you one free session?" I shrugged off the obvious deflection and said, "She's pretty good. She's giving me another freebie." "It's a scam." "I don't know. I think I have a shot with her." Corey grabbed my shoulder and said, "No way, man." He slapped my back. "She's so loose your dick will slip out sideways. But I pushed him away. "Why are you only funny off stage? That's what I want to know." "Hey, that hurts." Speaking of which, we walked into Jasper's. "Where's the next show?" The clerk looked up and nodded, his gauged earlobes swinging like mini tire swings. He was probably a local college kid, just scraping up some easy money for weekends and textbooks. Corey picked up a Tool CD, turning it around in his hands. "No next show. No more shows." I was moving to the used section, but I stopped. "What are you talking about? We're finally getting some real laughs." Corey put the CD back. "Real laughs? Marty? We're soliciting laughs through scare tactics." He ran his hand over his head, rubbing the stubble. "I'm a software programmer, not a comedian." I saw where this was headed. It was like 6 months previous when Sarah, his girlfriend, took up with a street performer. A mime. He walked in on them practicing the rope pull. "It's part of the act. You're like the next Andy Kaufman. It's over, Raft." He used my last name. This is worse than the mime fiasco. "Come on, let's go get a beer." "Fine, but you aren't changing my mind." He turned and walked out. I followed, but before I got through the door, some big guy grabbed Corey around the waist with one arm. In the other big hand, he had a hot dog. His chin was shiny and covered with drool. These images registered in snippets as I lunged through the door and pulled the man loose of Corey. The man stumbled back, surprised, and said, "Marty, what the hell?" Though there was real concern in the scrunched folds of his forehead and squinted eyes, he shoved the hot dog into his mouth. I didn't recognize the man at all, and I couldn't understand how he knew my name. He wasn't as tall as me, but he looked to weigh about the same. Only all his weight came from fat, where mine was muscle. With an unknown fear beginning to grip my heart, I said, "Back off." Corey seemed shocked out of his former mood. He stood by my side and a little behind, but looked ready to help out. And I wasn't above the consideration I might need help with this guy. Still chewing on his meat stick, bits of bun sticking to his chin, he said, "Marty, it's me, Skinny fella." Hey, buddy, Corey chimed in. I hate to break it to you, but you ain't no skinny fella, and you're certainly not the skinny fella. He looked at me as to confirm this large man was in fact a stranger. I said nothing, but instead backed off a step, pulling Corey with me. The big guy stared skyward with a euphoric look on his face. Hey, Corey, you should use that in your act. He slid his hand into the front of his pants. His wide lips turned up and spittle cascaded over his chin, dribbling onto his chest. He closed his eyes. Inside Jasper's, the pierced clerk came to the window and stared out at us. He had a weird grin on his face, half confusion, half enjoyment. He made no move to come out and help, but merely watched the show. Corey, I said, backing up, we should go. Now. The big guy's eyes snapped open. His hand emerged from his trousers only to enter his pocket. He moved forward, closing the gap I had tried to create. Across the street, a group of kids ran past an elderly couple. The old man put his arm around his wife and pulled her close. She smiled and looked over her shoulder at the kids turning around the corner. Cars continued unperturbed and oblivious of the scene unfolding on our side of the street. The only witness watched on through a pane of glass to our left. The stranger probed his pocket with one hand. The other went to his face. He patted it, feeling his cheeks, then his nose. His mouth opened. He shook his head and laughed. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. I'm still trying to get a hang of all this. His hand came out of his pocket holding a business card. He held it out to me. Listen, Marty, I won't be able to work the clubs with you for a while. The big man standing there holding out a business card. I actually pictured Skinny Fella handing me Naomi's card. Corey said, "Back off, psycho!" He nodded slowly as if addressing a small child. It's okay. Just take the card. When neither of us made a move to take it, the skinny imposter laughed, big cheeks shaking. He placed the card on the ground. All right, guys, I understand. Just take the card. I'll leave now. He turned away, and I saw his hand sneak back into the pants, just as a woman and her child were walking past. She grabbed the kid close and scurried by like a squirrel. Corey's mouth hung open as he watched the rotund figure galump into the distance. What just happened? I don't know. And I didn't. Not yet, anyway. I bent down to take the card. Marty! Back on a first-name basis. Don't pick that up! The guy had his hands down his pants, not to mention drool all over himself. I shrugged. Just remind me to wash my hands before I eat anything. I picked the card up and inspected it. Corey went up on tippy toes and tried to peer over my shoulder. Well? I shook my head. It's just an address in hours. It says midnight to 2 in the morning. I flipped the card over. Well, that makes a little sense at least. I held the card out to Corey. On the back, written in pen, it said mindfuckers. Something about the guy was familiar. And what he said, it made my mind tingle with nearly lost memories. Some old connection. Still on Main Street. I wasn't seeing the trees beyond the buildings, and I wasn't seeing the buildings. My eyes were turned inward, searching the crevices and folds of my brain. The skinny imposter. He said, "You should use that in your act." He said, "I won't be able to work the clubs with you for a while." How did he know about the clubs? About Corey's act? Was he in the crowd one night? Did he follow me and Skinny outside and hear us talking? Maybe he was trying to blackmail us. He could be waiting for us at the address that's on the card. Waiting with friends. How likely was that scenario? It reminded me of a television show or something I saw on the Lifetime Network. It was a prank, Corey said as if reading my mind. A prank? Yeah. He rubbed his head, smiling now. Didn't you hear the guy? He knew all about us in the act. Skinny put him up to this. It was a prank. It made a hell of a lot more sense than my idea. Give him a call on your cell. I wish you'd buy your own cell phone. Even elementary school kids have phones these days. And that makes it okay? I took out my silver case and retrieved a cigarette, automatically thinking of Dr. Pepper. I looked at Corey, who had the cell phone to his ear, but had already started shaking his head, as if he knew Skinny wouldn't answer. Rubbing my thumb over the contours of the cigarette case, I said, "Why didn't you come to the reunion?" Corey acted like he was trying to listen to something on the phone. He made a sour face. Hell, I'm surprised you went. There was no reason to go. I pocketed the case. Dr. Pepper. Corey shook his head and hit end on the phone. He wasn't there. You said so yourself. But you didn't know. How could you know he wouldn't be there? Corey continued to stare at his cell phone, even though it was no longer on, as if he was wishing for a call to come in. He rubbed his head, then the back of his neck. I took a drag. I exhaled as I said, "What?" The skin on his face looked loose, saggy around the mouth. Thinking back, I'm sure I knew what was coming. But the mind is funny. It's easy to ignore things you don't want to know, and this was at the top of my list. Corey looked up, his eyes wide. I didn't go because he's dead. He put his cell phone away, defeated. Cancer. 4 or 5 months ago. The smoke turned to acid in my mouth. How did... Obituary. Someone from our class emailed me. We both stood there, together but alone. I guess I knew why he didn't tell me. I guess it made sense. He wanted to shield me from death. After what happened to my parents, he probably thought he was doing me a favor, keeping this from me. But still, you can't hide from the dead. I put in my wireless earbuds. Corey didn't say a thing. I switched the music on, not bothering to take the MP3 player from my pocket, knowing every contour and button on its thin body. The snapping bass of Les Claypool filled my head, and I took a drag from my cigarette. Corey's features became pinched. His lips moved and formed words I couldn't hear. He could have said soup and crack, but somehow I doubted it. I said, "I'm not hungry." He shook his head and his lips formed more words, maybe gore and spittle, but I could only hear Les Claypool sing about the antipop. His lips moved again, and this time it could only be one word. His eyes were slits as he pointed past me. I turned and saw a man waiting at a bus stop, holding a suitcase. There was nothing abnormal about the situation, except, of course, the man in question was completely naked. I put the cigarette in my mouth and turned the music player off. That guy's naked. I know. What's he doing? He appears to be going to work. I didn't want to stare any longer than I had to, but there was something familiar about that absent gaze, the way his head was tilted up, the way he looked at nothing. Corey yelled out, "Hey, put some clothes on!" I let the cigarette drop from my mouth like a silent movie star. I placed my hand on Corey's shoulder. Maybe not the best idea. "What are you talking about? There are kids around!" He stepped closer to the man, now only a couple of yards away. "Listen, you better have some clothes in that briefcase." The man didn't respond. He made no move to suggest he even heard Corey. Corey turned to me, and I realized it was the first time I had ever stood behind him during a confrontation. Something was wrong with the whole situation. I didn't like it, and worse, I didn't know why. Corey started to say something, but I don't know what it was because I heard nothing past he. The man turned. His eyes were the first thing I saw. Maybe the only things. My impression was this guy put in special contacts to make them go all cloudy, like a dog's cataractous eyes, almost completely opaque. I felt lost in them, like driving down a foggy road and passing your own house. I was so lost that I didn't notice he had stepped into the street. That is, I didn't notice until his body was thrown forward by a yellow Hummer. 1 second he was there, the next, he was gone. I registered the event in slow motion. The Hummer's screeching tires and people's screams were all on delay. I truly didn't hear them until the body had settled. If I had been a true silent film star, or even a wannabe comedian like Corey, I would have waited until that moment to let the cigarette drop from my mouth. But Corey had already run to help. The naked man, he could have been clothed and I wouldn't have been able to tell. He was all red and twisted, like a Valentine's Day heart. Chewed up cherry bubble gum. Some people were on their cell phones, a few dialing numbers, some taking pictures. 1 or 2 ran to help Corey, but I continued to stand frozen. I was thinking about movies I had seen with similar accidents, television shows where people witnessed horrific events. I thought of these things and tried to remember how the characters acted, how they responded. Then I tried to match their emotions and expressions, but it felt wrong somehow. I would have followed Corey to help, but there was nothing I could do. The man was dead, and I was no doctor. My specialty was helping living people. I turned my music player back on. A Tool song began to play. I watched Corey as Maynard sang about vicariously living while watching the whole world die. My soundtrack to tragedy. That was chapter 6 of Soundtrack to the End of the World. If you enjoyed that and would like to read more, please consider buying a copy. Cheers.